The celebration had barely faded when the silence returned, heavier than the smoke that still lingered over the water. Men spoke in applause and triumph, but one man listened instead, measuring what victory had truly purchased. In that quiet, a realization formed. Some victories do not end things. They start something larger and far more difficult to control. He did not stand among cheering officers. He did not raise his glass or bask in the glow of success. Instead, Isoroku Yamamoto watched the room with the cautious gaze of someone who understood that momentum can be both power and trap. Reports arrived like waves. Targets struck. Ships destroyed. Casualties inflicted. The operation had gone almost exactly as planned. To most of the men around him, that meant one thing: proof. Proof that boldness wins. Proof that the Empire had been right to gamble. But Yamamoto's mind moved elsewhere. He had spent years studying adversaries others underestimated. He had walked the halls of foreign academies, listened to Western officers argue strategy, and watched industrial power at work. He had seen not only fleets, but factories. Not merely admirals, but citizens capable of being mobilized. When many saw the enemy as distant and divided, he saw capacity, vast, patient, and waiting. So when congratulations echoed through the room, his reaction was restrained. The operation had succeeded tactically. Strategically, it had done something more dangerous. It had awakened an opponent whose strength was not yet visible. Yet he could not say this openly, not fully, not now. Command is rarely the freedom to speak plainly. It is the burden of carrying knowledge others are not ready to hear. To suggest caution on the night of triumph risked appearing weak, hesitant, even disloyal. And so his words were measured, almost quiet. He acknowledged the skill of the pilots, the coordination, the bravery. He affirmed their discipline. But behind each sentence lived a deeper thought. Victory creates expectations. And expectations demand escalation. He knew what escalation meant. More operations. More deployments. More pressure to strike quickly again and then again, before the enemy could organize. Each success would require another, larger one. Each gain would widen the front, stretch logistics, and test resolve. Leadership would be trapped not by failure, but by its own momentum. This was the paradox. The better the strike had gone, the more dangerous the path ahead became. Yamamoto also understood something else. Silence contains responsibility. The room believed this was an ending. He sensed it was only the beginning of a series of choices that would narrow with each passing month. Once this path had been chosen, stepping back would become almost impossible. Nations rarely retreat from narratives of triumph. They are pulled forward by pride, fear, and the illusion of control. In the hours after the operation, away from the noise, he allowed the thought to take shape more clearly. The enemy had not been broken. The enemy had been provoked. What appeared decisive might, in time, be remembered as the moment when restraint vanished, on all sides. He did not know exactly how events would unfold. No commander ever truly does. But he recognized a pattern familiar to every strategist who has studied long wars. Early blows can distort judgment. They make the future seem simpler than it is. They convince leaders that initial success predicts the outcome. And once leaders believe that, they begin to plan for the war they imagine, instead of the war they actually face. That was the fear no one wanted to name. Because beneath the victory, beneath the applause, beneath the official statements, another question was forming, one that would not go away. What happens after the surprise fades? The answer, he suspected, would not be written by admirals in meeting rooms, but by time, industry, and nations pushed beyond what anyone in that room could yet see. And as the night grew quieter, the realization deepened. The true consequences of what had just been set in motion had not revealed themselves. Not yet. Morning arrived without celebration. It came with reports, cables, and the quiet tension of men who suddenly realized that victory had created a schedule. Decisions now had to move faster. Plans that once lived on paper were being pushed toward reality, and every admiral felt the pressure of momentum closing in. Yamamoto read each update carefully. Ship movements, intelligence estimates, early diplomatic signals. None of them were alarming on their own, but together they formed a picture he had seen before in theory, a nation that had been struck and would now begin to transform itself in response. He thought about maritime strategy as something larger than fleets. A fleet is steel. A strategy is time. And time was no longer neutral. Within the command structure, confidence was rising. Senior officers spoke about maintaining initiative, pressing further, striking while shock still lingered. Some saw the enemy as disorganized, emotionally shaken, unlikely to coordinate quickly. They argued that hesitation would waste the advantage. The subtext was clear. Boldness had been rewarded once. It would surely be rewarded again. Yamamoto understood the attraction of that argument. It was clean. It was simple. It avoided the uncomfortable questions about capacity, geography, and the long reach of industrial power. But the realism he carried from his years abroad refused to fade. He had walked factories that stretched farther than some harbors. He had seen production lines that did not rest. He had studied a culture that could absorb loss, learn from it, and respond with scale. To strike such a nation and expect it to remain stunned was not strategy. It was hope disguised as logic. Yet he also recognized his role. As commander, he was both architect and prisoner of the plan. He had argued for decisive early action to prevent a drawn-out struggle that Japan could not sustain. Now, paradoxically, that very action risked creating the protracted conflict he had wanted to avoid. This tension lived inside each briefing, each conversation, each moment he was asked for reassurance. He spoke carefully. He emphasized preparation, discipline, and caution in interpretation. He warned, indirectly, that initial success did not eliminate uncertainty. He reminded his officers that the enemy still possessed shipyards, fuel, raw materials, and an ability to coordinate across oceans. But he did so without alarm. Leaders must never sound afraid, even when they are deeply aware of risk. Outside the conference spaces, the narrative was different. Newspapers celebrated. Public speeches framed the operation as destiny fulfilled. The population, hearing only the outcomes and not the calculations, believed in a story of inevitable momentum. This created another pressure point. Strategy was no longer only military. It was psychological. To slow down now, to pause, to reassess, could be read as weakness by allies and opponents alike. That is the hidden cost of triumph. It closes doors. As the day progressed, Yamamoto returned repeatedly to one question. How long could surprise be sustained before the enemy adapted? He knew adaptation was inevitable. The only unknown was speed. And he also knew that every additional strike would teach the enemy more about tactics, about patterns, about vulnerabilities. The more they acted, the more the opponent would learn. In the privacy of his quarters, the weight of this reality pressed harder. He reviewed maps not as symbols of conquest, but as reminders of distance. Long supply lines, scattered islands, exposed positions. Defending everything would be impossible. Holding gains would require resources that were already finite. Each new objective would stretch command further, forcing difficult choices between consolidation and ambition. Those choices were approaching faster than anyone expected. He understood that once a nation commits to a path of escalation, strategy becomes less about choosing the best option and more about managing consequences of decisions already made. The future narrows. Alternatives vanish. Leaders find themselves explaining momentum rather than controlling it. And somewhere across the ocean, he imagined the quiet rooms where another set of officers were gathering around their own maps, absorbing the shock, and beginning to plan. Not for the first battle, for the long one. What that planning would eventually produce was still invisible to most in his command. But Yamamoto sensed it, like distant thunder forming beyond the horizon, a response that would grow, organize, and return. The question was no longer whether the enemy would answer. It was how far that answer would go. The weeks that followed did not feel like triumph. They felt like tightening. Orders multiplied. Meetings lengthened. Every decision seemed to carry two shadows, what it achieved now and what it might force later. In the corridors of command, the language shifted subtly, from celebration to necessity, from opportunity to obligation. Yamamoto noticed the change immediately. Operational plans now assumed action, not debate. Questions were no longer framed as "should we?" but "how soon?" The war had acquired its own gravity, drawing everyone forward, even those who sensed the danger of moving too quickly. He carried that awareness quietly. Behind closed doors, staff officers briefed scenarios with precision. Further advances, deeper strikes, new areas to secure. Each plan looked logical on paper. Each plan assumed coordination would remain perfect, supply lines intact, morale unshaken. And each plan quietly assumed that the enemy would continue reacting rather than shaping events. That assumption unsettled him. He had learned long ago that an adversary absorbs lessons at a pace that cannot be charted. What seems like passivity may be preparation. What appears to be silence may simply be calculation. As more reports arrived of mobilization abroad, industries waking, shipyards expanding, training accelerating, he saw the outline of something that others dismissed as distant. Time was no longer symmetrical. Inside strategic councils, debates still occurred, but they were constrained by pride and by fear of hesitation. Voices that suggested caution risked being labeled pessimistic. Voices calling for restraint risked being seen as uncommitted. In such environments, bold proposals often win, not because they are safest, but because they appear decisive. Yamamoto listened carefully, then spoke with deliberate restraint. He argued that surprise was not a permanent asset. He emphasized logistics and endurance, reminding the room that distance erodes strength as surely as combat does. He asked his officers to consider how the enemy might adapt, not just how Japan could advance. His tone remained calm, never accusatory. Leadership, he understood, required shaping thought without humiliating those who disagreed. Yet he also understood the paradox. He himself had advocated for boldness at the outset. He had believed that if war came, it must be rapid, concentrated, overwhelming, because a drawn-out conflict would reveal Japan's disadvantages. But now that boldness had worked, it had changed expectations. It had created momentum that resisted revision. Success had trapped the strategy in place. Beyond headquarters, another narrative hardened. Public faith grew. Propaganda magnified victories and minimized costs. The nation began to imagine a future defined by expansion, by destiny, by inevitability. That belief, once formed, could not easily be turned. States do not pivot gracefully once they have promised triumph. In private moments, Yamamoto weighed the moral gravity of command. Every operation would mean more young men launched across vast distances. More ships extended beyond safe support. More families taught to expect news that might never arrive. Strategy was no longer abstract. It lived in the faces of pilots he inspected, crews he addressed, officers who bowed as they left briefings. They trusted leadership to see farther than they could. He asked himself the question few dared voice. Was the path still being chosen, or merely followed? Maps offered answers that were never comfortable. Lines of advance intersected with lines of vulnerability. Positions gained on one front created exposure on another. Defenses required as much planning as attacks, yet attention drifted toward the dramatic, not the necessary. He understood that wars are often lost not in a single decisive moment, but through accumulations of pressure that leaders convince themselves are temporary. Temporary pressures have a way of becoming permanent. Meanwhile, intelligence reports hinted at a growing rhythm across the ocean. New ships laid down, pilots trained, fleets reorganized. Individually, these details appeared mundane. Viewed together, they revealed a trajectory. The enemy was not stunned. The enemy was assembling. And once assembly reaches critical mass, it does not simply respond. It redefines the battlefield. Yamamoto felt the weight of that future even as others spoke confidently of maintaining initiative. He knew that initiative is not merely striking first. It is sustaining the ability to choose. Every additional commitment reduced that freedom. Every advance required protection. Every success narrowed the range of exits. He wondered how long the illusion of control could hold. Because beneath all the planning, beneath the measured voices and polished briefings, one reality was approaching quietly, a reality no one could yet see completely, but one that would eventually force decisions far harsher than any being discussed in these rooms. And the moment when that reality would step out of shadow was drawing closer. The tone inside headquarters shifted again, not toward doubt, but toward urgency wrapped in confidence. Officers spoke with increasing fluency about operations far from home waters. Charts filled with arrows stretching outward, each one assuming coordination, endurance, and luck. The map looked bold. It also looked fragile. Yamamoto studied it quietly. He had spent his career understanding how distance erodes certainty. Supply chains lengthen. Weather intervenes. Communications falter. Small miscalculations at the beginning multiply by the time orders reach the edge of the theater. Yet in the atmosphere of momentum, these cautions felt almost impolite. Success had trained people to believe that risk would continue bending in their favor. He resisted that belief. In meetings, he emphasized prudence rather than triumph. He spoke of refit schedules, fuel reserves, pilot fatigue. He argued for deliberate pacing, not as hesitation, but as preservation of strength. His words were acknowledged, sometimes even praised. But acknowledgement is not the same as acceptance. Once narratives of inevitability take hold, realism becomes an uncomfortable presence in the room. Outside, the signals continued. Radio intercepts, diplomatic behavior, merchant traffic patterns. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The opponent was not scattered. It was concentrating. Training pipelines lengthened. Industrial programs accelerated. Where others saw statistics, Yamamoto saw trajectory. And trajectory, he understood, determines the battlefield long before fleets meet. He carried that knowledge alone more often than he preferred. Commanders cannot speak every fear. They must filter. They must choose which truths strengthen discipline and which risk paralyzing it. So he spoke in measured tones, avoiding alarm while urging preparation. Victory, he reminded them, was not the destruction of specific ships. Victory was the maintenance of strategic choice. Lose that, and every engagement becomes reactive. The temptation to escalate remained strong. Each proposal placed new weight on the same limited foundations: fuel, trained aviators, maintenance capacity, transport protection. He watched as contingency plans began to assume perfect sequencing. Strike here, secure there, redeploy quickly, suffer minimal losses. But war rarely grants symmetry. Something always arrives out of order. He thought of young pilots whose confidence had grown with each success. Confidence was valuable, but unforgiving when it met reality. He wondered how many of them would return from the operations now being discussed. He wondered whether anyone had fully calculated what would be required to sustain momentum once the enemy began choosing the battlefield rather than receiving it. Increasingly, he sensed a deeper shift beneath the surface. Decisions were becoming less strategic and more driven by fear of stopping. To pause was to admit uncertainty. To reconsider was to risk loss of face. And so operations were justified not only by opportunity, but by the anxiety of appearing unsure. That is when wars begin to feed on themselves. At night, he returned to the same maps with different eyes. Distances that had once made success seem dramatic now made defense seem precarious. Bases exposed. Lines thin. Reserves limited. The Empire's perimeter looked like confidence drawn in ink, but ink fades when pressure is applied long enough. He knew the enemy would eventually test those lines. Not with one blow, but with persistent pressure, probing, learning, adapting. The question was not whether Japan could win a battle. It was whether it could sustain a series of increasingly complex ones, across greater distances, under mounting strain, while the opponent grew stronger with each passing month. That calculation lay in the future, but its outline was already visible to him, as if seen through fog. And as planning intensified, as voices grew firmer, and as the narrative hardened, Yamamoto sensed the approach of a turning point, a moment when reality would begin to intrude on expectation, and the cost of earlier decisions would start demanding payment. It was closer than anyone wanted to believe. The first signs did not arrive as shock. They came as tension, subtle, persistent, easy to dismiss if one wanted to. Supply shipments arrived later than scheduled. Maintenance crews worked longer hours. Pilots rotated more quickly, with less time to recover. Nothing felt catastrophic. Everything felt slightly strained. Yamamoto recognized the pattern. Pressure rarely announces itself. It accumulates. And as it accumulates, leaders are tempted to believe they can manage it simply by willing themselves forward. Briefings now carried a different tone. Losses were discussed with professional detachment. Acceptable, some officers called them, within projections. Charts balanced casualties against objectives as if balance itself guaranteed sustainability. But beneath the numbers, he sensed something else, fatigue that did not yet dare to speak. He watched carefully. Reports from distant bases spoke of overworked ground crews and spare parts delayed by weather, distance, and competing priorities. Aircraft flew more hours than recommended. Crews slept less than they should. Pressure at the perimeter was being absorbed not by strategy, but by individuals. And individuals, he knew, eventually reach limits. In strategic conversations, a quiet tension emerged between consolidation and expansion. Some argued that gains must be fortified before pushing farther. Others warned that slowing down would surrender initiative and invite counterattack. Both arguments contained truth. The difficulty was that resources could not satisfy both. Yamamoto listened as debates sharpened. He understood that war forces leaders into choices that feel like contradictions. To defend, one must sometimes stop advancing. To advance, one must sometimes leave something undefended. Each decision created vulnerability elsewhere, and the further the perimeter extended, the more those vulnerabilities multiplied. He sensed the growing unease behind composed expressions. Intelligence summaries revealed what he had long expected. The enemy's shipyards were beginning to deliver results. New vessels, improved training cycles, increased coordination exercises. Nothing dramatic yet, but each fragment pointed in the same direction: scale. Scale cannot be outmaneuvered forever. He considered the pilots, many of them highly trained, irreplaceable, products of years of discipline and selective instruction. Replacing aircraft was difficult. Replacing men like these was far harder. Each loss carried forward into the future in ways the public would never see. He thought often about responsibility. Command, at its most honest, is not about maintaining appearances. It is about recognizing where illusion threatens judgment. Yet illusions thrive in environments where victory has once felt effortless. To question momentum sounded like retreat. To propose recalibration sounded like doubt. He chose his words precisely. He urged attention to logistics as a form of strategy, not merely support. He asked for realism in projections and discipline in interpreting successes. He spoke of conserving strength for the battles that had not yet appeared, the ones that would test endurance rather than daring. His counsel was respected, but the current carried everyone forward all the same. Outside military circles, the narrative continued to rise. Public pride hardened into expectation. Newspapers wrote with certainty. Children learned songs. Families were told that sacrifice would be brief, purposeful, rewarded. The deeper truth, that long wars consume far more than anyone intends, could not be spoken openly without seeming disloyal. Expectation became another front to manage. As weeks turned into months, Yamamoto began to see the outline of the dilemma more clearly. Japan had achieved a stunning opening, but in doing so had awakened an opponent capable of expansion at a pace that strategy alone could not cancel. The question was no longer simply how to win battles. It was how to prevent the war from evolving into something unwinnable. He studied maps late into the night. Distances grew larger when seen not as lines, but as strain. Every arrow outward represented fuel, coordination, vigilance, repair, and unbroken morale. Each new commitment added complexity. Each complex system is one failure away from cascading effects. He felt the quiet approach of something inevitable, not a single decisive catastrophe, but the gradual convergence of strain, adaptation, and reality. In the murmurs of staff conversations, in the exhaustion behind formal salutes, in the cautious tone of intelligence officers, he sensed that moment drawing nearer. Soon, the war would stop responding to expectation and begin imposing its own terms. And when that happened, decisions would become harsher, faster, and far more costly. The signs were already there. The revelation did not arrive in a single briefing. It emerged slowly, piece by piece, like a tide rising against a seawall built too quickly. Reports from patrols spoke of enemy formations appearing where they had not been seen before. Reconnaissance hinted at carriers operating with new confidence, protected by screens that were thicker, better organized, harder to approach unnoticed. Logistics summaries showed fuel stretched thinner, schedules slipping, maintenance deferred. Each item seemed manageable. Together, they described a war that had begun to shift out of Japan's control. Yamamoto understood it first as a feeling, a quiet recognition that initiative had begun to migrate across the ocean. He reread the cables carefully. The enemy no longer appeared surprised. Their movements suggested planning rather than reaction. They were probing, testing, forcing responses. And each time Japan answered, more resources were tied to specific positions, reducing flexibility elsewhere. This was the cost he had feared most. He realized that the strategic conversation had changed without anyone formally acknowledging it. Early in the conflict, discussions focused on what Japan might seize. Now, increasingly, they focused on what could not be surrendered. The perimeter, once described as protective, had become a responsibility that demanded constant attention. Responsibilities accumulate faster than victories. He felt it in the tone of briefings. Officers spoke with discipline, but there was less certainty in their assumptions. Losses were no longer theoretical. They bore names, faces, and consequences. Replacements arrived with less experience. Aircraft came back scarred. Fuel estimates tightened. Every operation carried a second calculation, not only what might be gained, but what stress the attempt would impose on the system that supported it. He thought again about silence. Silence had followed the first victory. Silence now followed reports of strain. Not because no one cared, but because acknowledging the full implication would force questions that were difficult to answer. How long could this pace be sustained? What would happen when the opponent reached full momentum? What adjustments were still possible? In private reflections, Yamamoto confronted a truth he had always known intellectually, but now felt deeply. Strategy is not judged by early success, but by whether its logic survives contact with time. Time was no longer on their side. Across the ocean, mobilization had matured. New ships entered service. Training pipelines delivered waves of aviators. Industrial output had begun to outpace loss. The enemy could replace what it lost. Japan could not, at least not at the same rhythm. That asymmetry, once theoretical, was now becoming visible in every operational plan. He carried the weight of this understanding with a mixture of clarity and regret. He had warned, in guarded language, that the war must be short or it would become impossible. But events had unfolded in a way that made shortening it beyond his control. Initial success had extended expectations. Expectations had extended commitments. Commitments had created vulnerabilities that now required defending. The war had entered a phase where choices narrowed, even as demands grew. He walked the decks of ships and looked at the faces of men who believed in the mission because they had to. Their composure was steady, their discipline remarkable. But no amount of courage could manufacture fuel, shorten distances, or slow industrial expansion across an ocean. Courage could win battles. It could not rewrite arithmetic. In strategic councils, he spoke with calm precision. He urged prudence in deployment. He argued for preserving strength where possible. He reminded them that the enemy was still learning, still adapting, still assembling. His warnings were heard, and yet the momentum of earlier decisions continued to move them forward. Leadership, he reflected, is sometimes the art of guiding a course that can no longer be fully altered. And beneath all the formalities, beneath the language of reports and orders, another realization took shape. The moment that began with applause had now matured into something far more complex. A contest not of surprise, but of endurance, resources, and time. The consequences that once seemed distant were no longer theoretical. They were approaching.